When people listen to our story and they hear that we've traveled around the world for over 6 years and that we've traveled to more than 75 countries, they begin to ask a few questions. And one of the first questions that they ask is, are you guys crazy?
And that's for you guys to decide.
And then they ask, how has your marriage managed to survive being together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year?
And that's for a book.
Or a disastrous reality TV show. Now, fortunately, they follow up with a couple more questions. They ask, how did this whole thing begin? And in particular, when they see the list of countries that we've traveled to, they ask, what's the most frightening thing that you've done on your trip? And strangely and ironically enough, the answer to those two questions takes me back to a point in time about 6.5 years ago. There we were, Dan and Audrey, two Americans living and working in Prague, Czech Republic, just down the road from here. Working traditional jobs, we were in the middle of our careers. And we had talked about traveling around the world and taking a creative sabbatical, and we had certainly done our share of talking and planning. We had certainly done our share of dreaming, and as probably everyone in this audience is aware, there was an enormous difference between dreaming and doing. So we had a decision before us. We could continue our lives as they were, with some level of certainty, security, safety, and satisfaction, but we could leave our curiosity about traveling around the world on the table, or we could get up and go. And the moment of realization that I go back to is sitting on the edge of our bed one night and asking ourselves the question, are we really ready to do this? Are we ready to take this risk? And one other question that we asked ourselves is, well, what if we just put it off for a little while longer? And we said, in 5 years, and then it turns to 10, and then it turns into 20, and the next thing we know, we're looking back and we're wondering, what if? And that's not something that we wanted to do, and that's not the life that we wanted to lead. And this is something that we continually refer to until this day as embracing regret avoidance.
Now, we've certainly had our share of frightening experiences on this journey. We've gotten stuck and lost in the mountains of Kazakhstan.
Terrifying. Kazakhstan again.
We jumped off the top of a building for I don't know why.
Equally terrifying.
We've gotten almost crushed at a border crossing between hundreds and hundreds of people.
Absolutely miserable.
And we bungee jumped off a bridge.
Miserable, terrifying, and fantastic at the same time.
But I can tell you that the single most frightening thing that we've done on this journey was hand in those resignation letters a little over 6 years ago. It wasn't just a commitment to, we're going to go travel. It was a commitment to leaving behind all that was familiar, what was comfortable, what was stable in our lives. We were embarking on something completely new, professionally and personally. And originally, we thought, oh, we'll just travel for about 12 or 18 months.
So as you can see, 6 years later, we misplanned just a little bit.
World's a very big place. But actually what happened was that continually we asked ourselves, what if, and we acted on it. What if? 2 simple words, a very, very simple question. But it's not something to ask yourself one time. It's something that we can do continually. It's something that we can do every single day. And for us, one of the most important questions that we asked ourselves, it's actually the guiding force of our journey, is what if we go and see for ourselves?
So this brings us to our first story. There we were at the end of 2011, and Audrey and I were about to set off to Iran, something that by many conventions is not a particularly wise thing for Americans to do. And during that time, it was a particularly challenging news and media cycle. And I remember having a conversation with one of my good friends who's normally very supportive of everything we do. And he said, dude, I think this is a very bad idea. And he said it as if he were saying goodbye and not expecting us to actually return. And we had Iranian friends, we had spoken to many people on the ground, and we knew that there was a different story. And we also knew that we had to go out and find it for ourselves.
And from the moment we arrived in Iran, we were welcomed everywhere we went. Iranians are actually incredibly friendly to visitors. But when they found out that we were from the United States, they went out of their way. They wanted to make sure that they showed their Iran, or that they showed their story. And I go back to one day in particular. It was a really, really great day. We were in Shiraz, a beautiful town in the southern part of the country. Beautiful mosques, really great gardens, really active market. And towards the end of the day, we were walking, Dan and I, through the markets, little alleys, little nooks and crannies. And I noticed in the corner of my eye, there was a group of teenage Iranian girls kind of giggling together, kind of cowering. It's kind of this universal thing, trying to muster up the courage to come up to us. And they finally did. First question they asked was, "Can we connect on Facebook?" And then, literally. And then the second question they asked was, "Can we go to the movies with you tonight?" And then we continued on in the market, and we met Babak. He was a grandfather, and he insisted on buying us Iranian ice cream so we could taste the local specialty. And we sat down with him for a while and had a long chat about Iran and the United States. And on our way out, we met a family. They're from the northern part of the country. And when they found out that we were going to be visiting them, they invited us to their house, insisted that we come to their house when we go to their hometown. So we're walking back that day, and we're thinking, wow, today was a really good day. And we get to the hotel, and I turn on the television.
First mistake.
And whether it was the Iranian channels or whether it was the international channels like CNN or BBC, the scenes from Iran that day were exactly the same. It was the 32nd anniversary of the taking of the American hostages. And across Iran, from Tehran to Shiraz, the exact town that we were in, there were demonstrations marking the event. And so I probably don't even have to explain to you what we saw on television that night. It's almost cliche at this point. You have on the ground the burning American flag. Up above, you have the Death to America signs. And then you have those camera close-up shots of really angry demonstrators. And I looked at Dan and I thought, same day, same town, what about all of our experiences? What about those teenage girls? What about Babak, the grandfather? What about the family that invited us to their home? Those were our experiences, but unfortunately, they don't make the cut. And that's why we had to go to Iran for ourselves to see.
People ask us, what's the greatest lesson in traveling around the world? And I can say this is the greatest lesson in travel and also in life, and that is the fundamental difference between fear and awareness. Fear at its most basic, think about it, it really doesn't require anything of us, or at least very little. We get to consume someone else's experience or someone else's impression, sit back with our fear, and then project our anxieties forward. Now, awareness, that's something different. That actually requires a little bit of work on our part. It requires perhaps to educate ourselves and to increase our understanding and to seek out an opportunity, perhaps, firsthand experience so we can form our own impressions. And when we begin to exchange a little bit of fear for awareness, we begin to open ourselves up. And when we open ourselves up, some beautiful things can happen. And this brings me to our next story today, which is from the Republic of Georgia in the former Soviet Union. There we were, Audrey and I were headed to hike the High Caucasus Mountains, and along the way we stopped in a town called Zugdidi at the foot of the hills. And as we're apt to do, we went into the local fresh market. And we went and took some photos, and we were hanging out with people, and we were exercising our broken Russian. Audrey's Russian is much better than mine, I can tell you. We had a great time. And on the way out of the market, I said to Audrey, you know, all throughout the Republic of Georgia, we have been looking for this dish called lobio. It was like a bean dish or sort of bean soup, but we haven't been able to find it. It's been very difficult. I wonder if the people in that market might know. What if we go back in and ask? And so we did. And we approached a couple of the women, and I asked them, and these are the women here. The woman in the middle, her name is Layla, and those are her friends. And I approach her, and I say, I'm looking for this bean soup. Do you know where I might be able to find it? And I think in my broken Russian, it probably sounded something like, bean soup? Me want? You have? But she understood, and she said, yes, we have the bean soup. And then she says, wait. And the next thing we know, they take a couple of tables, set them up in the middle of the marketplace for us, put down a couple of chairs, and lo and behold, 5 or 10 minutes later, 2 beautiful bowls of bean soup for us. But more than that, each one of the people in that marketplace came up to us with a little something that they were selling and gave it to us. And so the bread guy came up and gave us some bread, the cheese woman came up and gave us some of her cheese, and the honey guy came up and gave us some honey, and the vegetable guy came up and gave us some tomatoes and cucumbers. But the thing that I remember most is a woman no younger than 65 or 70 comes up with this clear jug of something toxic looking, and she plunks it down on the table. Turns out it is the Georgian version of fire water, something called cha-cha. And she pours a couple of shots like this, and then she points at me. She wants absolutely nothing to do with Audrey. She wants to tear me up. And the next thing I know, I'm going shot for shot with a 70-year-old woman in the middle of the market in Zugdidi.
He lost.
I lost. Actually, you could say my liver lost. I don't think it's ever actually recovered from that trip. But the point of this story is this: the greatest generosity on earth is the generosity of spirit. It is not about money, it's not about stuff. And when I think back to the people in that market, they didn't have very much. Many of them were poor, many of them were refugees, and all they wanted to do was show a little bit something about themselves and share with us a little bit of their culture. And this is something that's continually reaffirmed throughout the world, throughout our travels, and we find it's the rule rather than the exception. And so I'm thinking about this entire experience in Georgia, and I sort of take a step back and I think, really, this is the greatest generosity, is the generosity of the human spirit. And don't forget to ask about the bean soup.
You never know what might happen. So great, how do I top that story? So let's think about positive impulse, positive change, the generosity of spirit. And what does that do in terms of affecting change? What if we take a different path? And for this, we go to India. We were working on a storytelling and photography project for a small microfinance organization. We hopped on a train in Calcutta, we got picked up at the train station, put into a Jeep, hours and hours and hours on these bumpy roads. And then finally, the road literally ends at the foot of a village. And as I look out, I see that there's the group of women in their beautiful saris, colorful saris, sitting on the ground with their children in a semicircle. And they're waiting patiently for us. It was one of the most humbling experiences of this journey. But I did muster the courage to get out of that Jeep. I went to them and I began asking questions. I asked them to share their story. And it turns out that these women, 5 years ago, barely knew each other. In fact, they barely left the house. They had husbands who didn't trust them with money, and many of them were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. But in the course of 5 years, they began working together in these small groups. They took some loans, $50, $100, and they built businesses. There was a woman with a little shop on the side of the road. Another woman was growing plants for a nursery. There was another woman who was pursuing her dream of homeopathy. But more than that, these women who were different ages and different castes had actually come together as a community, and they realized they had a lot more in common with each other than they had differences. So together, they not only pushed the boundaries of gender roles in their village, but they actually started breaking down the caste roles as well, the societal roles. So I had one last question for these women. I said, okay, all this is great, but what is the best thing about being part of this program? And there were giggles, and you could see eyes moving back and forth. And finally, one woman was brave, and she stood up, shoulders back, proud body language, and she said, we realize we don't need our husbands anymore. Now, those may sound like fighting words in this room, but I can tell you that coming from the mouth of a young woman in rural India, it's one of the most inspiring things I've ever heard. So for me, every time that I think that something's too difficult to change or perhaps too big to change, I think back to those women in a village in India. And I also believe that every day, they're standing up to societal norms, and every day they're trying to break them down and challenging 1,000 years of convention. So great things truly do start small.
So the problem with lessons and inspiration is they can sometimes trick us, and so I've got some bad news.
There's always bad news.
Thank you. It's not always that easy. In fact, the things that are most worthwhile in life are, in fact, actually quite difficult. And so the question is, what if we find a way to take another step and to keep going when we don't believe we can take another step? And this brings me to a story about climbing Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania at the top of Africa. The funny thing about this hike is the first couple of days you're thinking, wow, this really isn't too bad. It's hard, but it's not that bad. But things change on that final night, the summit night, and all bets are off. You go to bed and they wake you up a couple hours later at 11 p.m. And they feed you a bowl of porridge. And you know that things are bleak when the best thing for you is a lukewarm bowl of yucky oatmeal. And then they put you outside, and it's midnight, and it is freezing cold. You have many layers of clothing on. It is completely pitch dark, and you've got your headlamp on. And there we were, 5 of us, about to set off up the mountain. And we get started, and it is slow, and there's scree, and there's switchbacks, and it is one of the worst experiences I've ever had in my life to actually in the outdoors. And the next thing I know, I look back, and one of the women in our group breaks down and she begins crying and she says, I can't go any further. And we knew deep within our hearts and deep within our bones exactly what she felt. And we could sympathize and empathize with every single thing that she was feeling. But our guide said, look, you have to really continue up the mountain. We're going to stay back and we'll take care of Jo and her husband. And so we continued. We were three. It was me and Audrey and a young woman from Finland named Maya. And we continue our way up that hill, and I can tell you, I remember looking and seeing all the various headlights up to the sky and thinking, how are we ever going to get up there? How are we ever going to make it? Well, a couple hours later, we get a little bit of break, and we get a little bit of sunlight at the end of the tunnel, and we find ourselves at a place called Gilman Point, just about 2 hours south of the summit. And as Audrey and I are going up there, there's Maya, and she turns around, and she begins crying. And she says, I'm sorry I wasn't able to say this before, but my father died last week. I'll tell you, just at that moment in life where you feel like you are the only person on earth and you are the only person in the universe, life shows you perspective in some of the strangest of ways. And just when you think you're the only one experiencing pain and you're the only one struggling, there are others struggling in your midst. And Maya continued the story, and she talked about how she had a discussion with her mother in the days before, and she decided to climb Mount Kilimanjaro for her father, who was an avid mountaineer and adventurer, in his honor. And as I'm getting my head around this, I look behind me, and there's Maya, and she's smiling, and she says, I'm happy here. I think I'm going to stay here. What are you going to do? And she looks at us, and I'm thinking, gosh, what do we do? Do we stay here for support? And there's a voice in my head that says, wait, we came here for one thing and one thing only, and that's to get to the top of that mountain. And I say, I think we're going up there. And the next thing I know, Maya is the one who's leading the way. And a couple hours later, we make it to the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro. And it is something beautiful. Sunlight, sunrise over the glaciers, and we are sitting there laughing and crying and celebrating, and it was something of great beauty. And the next thing I know, I turn around 5 or 10 minutes later, and there are Jo and Damien to join us, all 5 of us together on the summit. And I can tell you, if it happened to us once, it happened to us 100 times that we wanted to stop that night. But we somehow found the inner strength to continue both individually and collectively. And I can tell you that individual accomplishment is something spectacular, but that shared accomplishment is something truly sublime.
So at this point, you might be saying, okay, great, Dan and Audrey. You've taken us around the world. You shared with us all these stories. You told us what happened when you asked and acted on what if. And what of it all? This is what it tells us, that we are a fabric of our stories, each one of us individually, and together collectively. And with that, I have one last story. So at the beginning of our trip, we were in central Vietnam, and we met a young woman. She invited us to her home to have tea with her family. And we began talking about food and politics, things like life and family. And finally, we got on the topic of the Vietnam War. And so we asked her, how is it that here we are, 2 Americans traveling through your country? And even though the history between our countries is relatively recent, how is it that we're met with such friendliness?
And she said something astonishingly simple. She said, the past is behind us. All we have is today and tomorrow. And so you might be thinking, wow, those are beautiful words, but what do they have to do with what if? Think about it. What if is so often used to project us into the past, to note some kind of missed opportunity. But what if we turn it around and look at this in a different way? And what if we use what if to project ourselves into the future and to admire and to honor the possibility before us, perhaps to exchange a little bit of what might have been for what could be? Our what ifs, they are going to change the scope of our day. They may change the scope of our entire lives. And one what if may take us halfway around the block, while another what if is going to take us all the way around the world. We are our story, and some people claim that our story is written for us when in fact our story is ours to write. So tonight, when you find yourself sitting on the edge of your bed, perhaps you'll ask yourself the question, what is my what if? Thank you.
Thanks.